The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to address the resolution that the Senate is now considering. In 2015, 85 United States senators voted for the law fixing No Child Left Behind that reversed the trend to a national school board and restored decisions to classroom teachers, to local school boards, and to states. The Wall Street Journal said it was the largest devolution of federal control to the states in a quarter of a century. The Department of Education regulation that this resolution seeks to overturn does exactly the reverse. It begins to restore the national school board, and it takes away responsibilities from classroom teachers, local school boards, and states. It does this in direct violation of the law that 85 senators voted for just 15 months ago. So the question before us today is not only whether we believe in a national school board or we believe in local school boards. More important, perhaps, the question is, who writes the law? Does the United States Congress write the law, or does the United States Department of Education write the law? Article 1 of the United States Constitution says the United States Congress, elected by the people, writes the law. So the purpose of this resolution is to overturn a regulation of the Department of Education that in 7 cases directly violates the Every Student Succeeds Act, passed just 15 months ago, and in 16 other cases exceeds the authority allowed by that law. This regulation would say to states, ignore the law that 85 senators just passed 15 months ago. Ignore the law that President Obama called a Christmas miracle. Ignore the law that governors and teachers and school boards and superintendents all supported, and even ignore why they supported it, and listen instead to the unelected bureaucrats at the United States Department of Education. This regulation issued by the Department of Education specifically does things or requires states to do things that Congress said in our law fixing No Child Left Behind that the Department of Education cannot do. Therefore, it violates the law. In this law, Congress said to the department, you cannot tell states exactly what to do about fixing low-performing schools. That's a state decision. But this regulation does that anyway. And Congress said to the department, you cannot tell states exactly how to rate the public schools in your state. But this regulation does that anyway. This is not a minor matter. The remarkable consensus that developed in the 2015 bill in support of fixing No Child Left Behind was to reverse the trend to a national school board and restore to states, to classroom teachers, and to school boards decisions about what to do about the children in 100,000 public schools. Teachers, governors, school board members, all were fed up with Washington telling them so much about what to do about the children in their schools. So this regulation, which contravenes the law, specifically goes to the heart of the bill, fixing No Child Left Behind. It's very unusual, Mr. President, in federal law to specifically prohibit a department from regulating on an issue. But that's exactly what Congress did in 2015. Here are 7 specific examples of how the regulation, which we seek to overturn, violates prohibitions Congress explicitly wrote into the law. Number 1, the regulation prescribes long-term goals and measurements of progress that states establish for student subgroups. The law says, for example, that the secretary may not tell a state that goals set for students of one race must improve their progress 20% better than the progress of a group of students of another race. That's an example. Yet the regulation says that states must establish goals and measurements for lower performing subgroups that, quote, require greater rates of improvement, unquote, which would necessarily mean that students of one race would have to do better than students of another race. Number two, the regulation requires federally prescribed actions to be taken in schools that do not annually test up to 95% of their students. The law says that states must annually test not less than 95% of all students and each subgroup of students. But states determine, the law says, how to hold schools accountable for ensuring that 95% of students participate on annual tests. The Secretary of Education, the law says, may not prescribe, quote, the way in which the state factors the 95% testing requirement into their accountability system. Yet, the regulation we seek to overturn prescribes 4 different specific ways that states must take action in schools that miss the 95% requirement. 3, the regulation prescribes that schools with consistently underperforming subgroups of students be identified with a lower summative determination. Now, the law says states are required to identify schools for targeted support when a subgroup of students, quote, is consistently underperforming in a manner as determined by the state. That's what the law says. So the Secretary can't tell states under the law how to identify the lowest performing schools or what a school's rating should be. Yet, the regulation we're seeking to overturn says states are, quote, required to demonstrate that a school with a consistently underperforming subgroup receive a lower summative determination than it would have otherwise received, unquote. The Department of Education is meddling into the methodology of school ratings again, despite the fact that Congress said it could not. Number 4, the regulation prescribes the timeline for identifying schools with consistently underperforming subgroups. The law says states are required to identify schools for targeted support when a subgroup of students is, quote, consistently underperforming in a manner as determined by the state. Now, Mr. President, we had lengthy discussions about this. These issues in education are filled with conflict, filled with different opinions. I said many times during the debate that working on an education bill in the Senate is kind of like being in a football stadium on game day at Penn State or the University of Tennessee. Everybody in the stands has played football and they know what play to call, and they usually do. So everybody had an opinion. So we had to work these things out, and we wrote down carefully the agreement that we elected officials had. So we wrote down that the Secretary of Education may not impose new requirements or criteria on a state accountability system, such as a timeline for the identification of lowest performing schools. Yet the regulation prescribes an exact timeline of 2 years. Number 5, the regulation requires states to resubmit their plans to the Secretary every 4 years. Well, the law says the state plan, quote, shall be periodically reviewed and revised as necessary by the state educational agency, period. Yet the regulation says states must review and revise their state plans, quote, at least once every 4 years and submit its revisions to the Secretary for review and approval. Number 6, the regulation dictates exactly how school districts with significant numbers of low-performing schools must measure resources for students. The law says states must, quote, periodically review resource allocation to support school improvement in districts that are serving a significant number of low-performing schools. The law says the Secretary cannot tell states what to review. Yet, the regulation says that in addressing resource inequities, states must review differences in the following: rates of ineffective, out-of-field, or inexperienced teachers, access to advanced coursework, access to a full-day kindergarten and preschool programs, access to specialized instructional support personnel, and per-pupil expenditures of federal, state, and local funds. But, Mr. President, the law said the Secretary could not tell states what to review. 7, the regulation says tell states how to count students in subgroups. The law says each state decides the minimum number of students that should be included in the state's count of subgroups. So, a state is free to decide that for students to be included in a state's subgroup data, there might be at least 35 students, for example, of a subgroup in a school. The law says the Secretary may not impose new requirements or criteria on state accountability systems. Yet, the regulation we're seeking to overturn says states must pick a number below 30, or you'll have to explain yourself to the Secretary. Mr. President, that is flat in violation of a specific prohibition passed by this body with 85 votes and signed by the President of the United States. Now, that's 7 ways that the regulation specifically violates prohibitions placed in the law to keep the Secretary from doing what the Secretary then turned around and did. Now, here are 16 more ways that the regulation exceeds the authority of the United States Department of Education. To some, this may seem minor. To some, it may seem dull. It's not dull to me. I don't think it's dull to most senators. I mean, Article 1 of the Constitution isn't dull. We're elected to write the laws. And anytime we turn over to somebody else, whether it's the court or whether it's the executive branch, that constitutional prerogative, we violated our oath, in my opinion. Number 1, the regulation limits how states measure school quality or school success. The law says states must include at least one measure of school quality or student success that has to be, quote, valid, reliable, comparable, and statewide. The Secretary cannot tell states what measures to use in their state accountability systems. Yet, the regulation tells states they can only choose indicators that meets the criteria that the department comes up with. Number 2, the regulation limits how states measure school quality or school success for indicators used specifically in high school. Here is what the law says. States must include at least one measure of school quality or student success specific to high schools, and it has to be, quote, valid, reliable, comparable, and statewide. The Secretary cannot tell states, the law says, what measures to use in their state accountability system. Yet, the regulation tells states they can only choose indicators that meet criteria the department comes up with. Number 3, the regulation tells schools marked as low performing they will always be low performing unless they improve on indicators the U.S. Department of Education has identified. Now, Mr. President, the law says something different. It says that test and graduation rates have to count more in the state accountability systems than other indicators of school quality or school success. But the Secretary of Education may not prescribe the weight of any measure or indicator used to identify or meaningfully differentiate schools. The regulation says that a low-performing school must continue to be identified as a low-performing unless it improves on test and graduation rates, even if the school is making significant progress on other measures of school quality or student success, such as, for example, absenteeism, or perhaps family engagement, something chosen by the state. Number 4, the regulation requires school districts where schools aren't testing 95% of students to develop and implement a federal improvement plan. The law says states must annually test not less than 95% of all students and each subgroup of students. The law leaves it to states to determine what to do in school districts with schools that are failing to meet the participation requirement. Yet the regulation tells states how to address school districts where schools aren't testing 95% of students. It invents out of whole cloth the idea of a federal improvement plan, and then it mandates it. And similarly, the regulation requires schools alone, single schools, that aren't testing 95% of students to develop and implement a federal improvement plan. Now, the law says that states must annually test not less than 95% of all students in each subgroup, but the law leaves it to states to determine what to do in schools that are failing to meet the participation requirement. Yet the regulation tells states how to address schools that aren't testing the 95% of students. Again, it invents out of whole cloth the idea of a federal improvement plan with regulation for federally prescribed elements, and then it mandates it. A sixth example of provisions where the regulation exceeds the authority granted by the law. The regulation tells states how to measure high school graduation rates. The law says each state will establish long-term goals for all students in each subgroup of students, including the goal of high school graduation rates using either, quote, the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate, or, at the state's discretion, the extended year adjusted cohort graduation rate. Yet the regulation says states can only use the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate to identify low-performing schools in their accountability systems. You can see, Mr. President, that throughout these examples, there appears to be a deliberate attempt by the Department of Education not to interpret the law, but to ignore the law, or specifically to contravene the law, to thumb the nose of the regulation writers at the United States Congress and the President who passed and signed the law. Number 7, the regulation requires each state to come up with a definition for an ineffective teacher. The law says each state will describe how low-income and minority children enrolled in schools are not served at disproportionate rates by ineffective teachers, yet the regulations says states have to define ineffective teachers. It's going to make it nearly impossible for states not to implement an entire teacher evaluation system to follow the regulation. And in the same way, number 8, the regulation requires each state to come up with a definition of an out-of-field teacher. That's what the regulation does, but the law just says it describes how low-income and minority children enrolled in schools are not served at disproportionate rates by out-of-field teachers. The regulation says you have to define that. Regulation requires each state to come up with a definition for an inexperienced teacher. Law simply says you have to make sure that children are not served by inexperienced teachers, yet the regulation goes on to require definition. Number 10, the regulation tells states to report on the number and percentage of all students and subgroups of students who are not included in the state's accountability system. The law says each state will report a clear and concise description of the state's accountability system, including the minimum number of students that the state determines are necessary to be included in each of the subgroups of students. Yet the regulation requires states to provide new information outside the scope of what is required by the law. 11, the regulation tells states how to rate schools, and the state accountability system has to produce a single rating for each school. That was not envisioned by the law. The law says that states must create a system of evaluating all public schools in the state. It says further, the Secretary of Education may not prescribe the specific methodology used by states to evaluate schools. Yet, the regulation tells states that the results must lead to a single summative determination for each school. Now, a state might choose to do that, or a state might choose not to do that. That was the decision of the Congress, but the department decided differently. Number 12, the regulation adds a requirement that a state's accountability system has to include at least 3 levels of performance. But the law says states have the flexibility to establish a system of meaningful differentiation of schools without any parameters or federally prescribed methodology. Now, that couldn't be clearer. Without any parameters or federally described methodology. Yet the regulation prescribes a requirement that states use at least 3 distinct levels of performance for schools. 13, the regulation prescribes when schools may exit from identification as the lowest performing. The law says states must establish statewide criteria for schools to exit from being identified as in need of improvement. The Secretary of Education, the law says, may not prescribe what the exit criteria are. That is a decision left up to states. But the regulation, it narrows the state's ability to develop their own criteria for schools to be no longer identified as the lowest performing. 14, and there are 3 more of these. The regulation prescribes how states intervene in school districts with schools that are labeled as the lowest performing. The law says this: if a low-performing school does not meet a state's criteria for no longer being identified as lowest performing, then the state must take a, quote, more rigorous state-determined action, unquote. The Secretary of Education cannot prescribe under the law any specific strategies to improve schools. Yet the regulation requires the state to tell school districts to take interventions the department has prescribed. 15, the regulation prescribes how school districts intervene in schools that are labeled as low performing. The law says if a low performing school does not meet statewide criteria for no longer being identified as lowest performing, the state must take a more rigorous state-determined action. The Secretary can't prescribe specific strategies, yet the regulation requires the school to take federally prescribed action, exactly what the law says she or he cannot do. We've already tried federal one-size-fits-all actions under the School Improvement Grant and No Child Left Behind. We rejected that, and we don't think Washington should be in this business of telling schools how to fix themselves. Finally, 16, the regulation limits how states award school improvement funding to school districts and schools. The law says states must establish the method they will use to award school improvement funding to school districts. The regulation says it dictates to states how much they have to award to low-performing schools receiving school improvement funds. Here is what this resolution overturning the regulation would do, Mr. Preston. The resolution would ensure that the law fixing No Child Left Behind is implemented as Congress wrote it. The regulation violates the law and its clear prohibitions on the Secretary by prescribing new requirements through regulation or as a condition of a state plan approval. In the law we passed, Congress reached an agreement about requiring states to identify a certain number and types of schools that need to be improved, but it left to the states to determine how to go about fixing those schools and how long they had to fix the schools. The regulation prescribes how states and school districts intervene in and improve schools that do not improve. Secondly, the resolution restores state flexibility. The resolution restores state flexibility. The regulation is in direct conflict with the intent of the law to allow states and school districts to have greater flexibility to implement the law, which was what Congress intended. We reached an agreement that there are some essential elements of a state accountability plan that need to be included in that plan. But the other half of the agreement was that we left to the states the decisions about how to include those factors in their accountability systems. This is about Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress wrote the law with specific rules in mind. The Secretary of Education and his or her bureaucracy do not get to treat Congress as a minor impediment to the education system of their choosing. If they want to write the laws of the land, they should run for Congress, get themselves elected, draft a bill or an amendment, not wait for Congress to finish our work and then try to undo it through a simple regulation. This resolution, overturning the regulation, would preserve local decision making. As I mentioned, the Wall Street Journal editorialized when we passed the law that it was the largest devolution of federal control to states in a quarter of a century. The regulation tried to restore Washington, D.C. decision-making with mandates that states comply with specific requirements instead of letting states determine how best to proceed. This resolution scuttles new and burdensome reporting requirements in the regulation, which created new reporting requirements on states and districts that will drive up compliance costs and divert resources away from students and arguments. Now let me conclude, Mr. President, by dealing with some of the arguments and misinformation that I've been hearing about the resolution. Number one, I want to make clear that this resolution, overturning the regulation, strengthens accountability in our public schools the way Congress determined to do it in the law fixing No Child Left Behind. We transferred most of that responsibility for accountability from Washington, D.C. to states and local school boards. We did not want a national school board. The law also includes federal guardrails to ensure quality public education for all students, including, for example, requiring states to identify and provide support to low-performing schools, at least the lowest-performing bottom 5% of each state's schools, requiring academic and English language proficiency indicators to be included in each state's accountability system. The law's federal guardrails will shape how states design their accountability systems because a state plan would not be following the law if the state fails to include accountability provisions in their plan. So the repeal of this regulation does not let states, the ones who are supposed to be addressing accountability, off the hook by any means. Repealing this regulation simply ensures that individual states and their governors, legislators, chief state school officers, local school boards, superintendents, principals, PTAs, parents, classroom teachers are responsible for these decisions. This resolution, overturning the regulation, will allow states to implement the new law on the existing timetable to submit their plans and have the department review and approve state plans. U.S. Education Secretary DeVos has said that she favors the current timetable, the one established by former Secretary King. She said this at her confirmation hearing before our committee. She confirmed that again after taking office. I'd like to insert in the record at this point, and I ask consent to do that, her letter from February 10 to the chief state school officers outlining the timetable.
Without objection.
So there's no confusion, let me clearly state what that timetable is. States should continue, number one, to submit state accountability plans by the April or September 2017 deadlines. Number two, implement a state accountability system in the 2017-2018 school year. Number three, identify the lowest performing schools in needs of comprehensive support and improvement by the beginning of the 2018 or 2019 school year. To write these plans, state needs simply to consult the law. The Every Student Succeeds Act requires states to submit a plan for peer review and approval by Secretary DeVos and the Education Department. The department is committed to working with states, providing technical assistance, issuing non-regulatory guidance and other support materials. If questions arise, there are a variety of ways to answer the questions. The department will continue to provide states with clarification on how to comply with the law through the use of, for example, non-regulatory guidance, through Dear Colleague letters, through frequently asked questions documents, webinars, phone calls, in-person conferences. In other words, if there are any questions about how to comply with the timetable under the new law, there are plenty of ways for chief state school officers and others to ask the U.S. Department of Education to provide the answer. It's important to emphasize, I suppose, that this resolution does not in any way give the Education Secretary a path to creating a new federal voucher program. Some of my friends on the other side of the debate have been resorting to scare tactics and alleging Secretary DeVos will use the opportunity to regulate into existence a mandate that state and local school districts adopt a school voucher program. The Secretary of Education doesn't have that power, and this Secretary of Education has said she doesn't want it. Secretary DeVos has repeatedly affirmed her opposition to federally mandated school choice, saying that she does not and will not advocate for any federal mandates requiring vouchers. States should determine the mechanism of choice, if any, unquote. A school choice program cannot unilaterally be created by the United States Department of Education. Only Congress could create a voucher program. I tried to do that on the floor of this Senate during the debate about fixing No Child Left Behind. I offered an amendment called Scholarship for Kids. It would have allowed states to use existing federal dollars to follow the children of low-income families to schools of their parents' choice. Senator Scott of South Carolina offered a similar amendment. But only 45 senators voted for our proposals. And if you pay attention around here, you know that for most important things, it usually takes 60 votes to gain approval. Also, the 2015 law that we passed actually includes provisions that would prohibit the Secretary from mandating, directing, or controlling a state district or school's allocation of state or local resources, and bars the Department of Education from requiring states and districts to spend any funds or incur any costs not paid for under the law. For example, vouchers. Now, I agree that previous secretaries of education have imposed their own personal policy preferences on states and school districts. I opposed such mandates, even if I agreed with them, and worked against them. Congress writes the law, not the secretary, not the bureaucracy. But instead of using this scare tactic to rile up teachers and parents around the country, misleading them and confusing them about what the Secretary of Education might do, I'd take that argument and turn it around. If Congress takes a stand here and now and says that this regulation exceeds the authority granted by Congress, the authority delegated to the Secretary of Education, because the Secretary imposed conditions on states not allowed by law, then that means any current or future Secretary of Education would be similarly prevented from imposing their own conditions on states. So there could be no legal method of forcing states to adopt a voucher program unless Congress passes a new law. There could be no legal method of reinterpreting the Every Student Succeed Act to impose the next good education idea, however well-intended, unless Congress acted first. Then the suggestion has been made that these regulations, that this new law requires regulations. This regulation and other regulations are not required by the law fixing No Child Left Behind. The law does not specifically call for accountability regulations. The law allows for accountability regulations, but, quote, only to the extent that such regulations are necessary to ensure that there is compliance, unquote. So there is no requirement for this regulation. It is allowed, but it is not required. Congress wrote prohibitions on the Secretary so that states wouldn't be faced with a bunch of new mandates that add new requirements that are inconsistent with or outside the scope, or add new criteria that are inconsistent with or outside the scope, or in excess of statutory authority granted to the Secretary. That's what we did. In the law, we laid out requirements for state plans. State can simply follow the law. A regulation isn't necessary. Mr. President, future secretaries will still be able to write regulations on this subject under the Congressional Review Act, which is the procedure under which we're operating. If Congress overturns a regulation, as I hope it will in this case, the agency, the Department of Education, is prevented from making final a new regulation that is, quote, substantially the same, unquote, to the overturn regulation, unless Congress passes a new law to create an opportunity for that new regulation. No court has defined what substantially the same means, but the common sense interpretation of that is very simple. The department simply can't turn right around and do the same thing Congress has just overturned. It could do something else by regulation, but it couldn't do precisely that. So this is a question of whether we're going to restore the National School Board that 85 senators voted to reverse 15 months ago. And this is also a question of whether you believe that the United States Congress writes the law or the U.S. Department of Education writes the law. I believe that under Article 1 of our Constitution, the United States Congress writes the law. And when it's signed by the President, then that's the law, and that the regulations must stay within it. And that is especially true when Congress has written explicit prohibitions about what a secretary may do and may not do. The remarkable consensus around the bill fixing No Child Left Behind was to reverse the trend to a national school board and restore to states, to classroom teachers and parents, the decisions about what to do about their children in public schools. Teachers, governors, school boards, parents, all were fed up with Washington telling them so much about what to do about their children in 100,000 public schools. So this regulation, which contravenes the law, specifically goes to the heart of the bill, fixing No Child Left Behind, which received 85 votes here in the Senate. And this resolution to overturn that regulation upholds the law that received aye votes from those 85 senators. I encourage my colleagues to support this resolution and to vote aye one more time. I believe that overturning the regulation preserves the consensus and the compromise that we achieved when we enacted the law fixing No Child Left Behind. Mr. President, I yield the floor. And I notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.